Abraham Lincoln called for troops when the Southern states opened hostilities by firing upon Fort Sumter in April of 1861. The United States Army had been organizing for potential hostilities for several months, but fielded far too few troops to address an insurrection by 11 states. In the Civil War's early years, the Union raised troops primarily through the recruitment of volunteers. Only in 1864 did Illinois experience a military draft. Most states also organized their own military units, which worked with the United States Army's regular units in the field.
In the surge of outrage and patriotism that accompanied war's outbreak, Illinois quickly produced more volunteers than immediately required. One man walked over 20 miles to enlist. Another volunteer recalled how the people of his community greeted secession with indignation. Local men organized public meetings where speakers blew the fife and beat the drum and exhorted the men to rally round the flag. The men of his unit left home burning with desire
proceeded to
wipe
state military
treason
training
from the
camps located near Springfield and in southern Illinois at Alton, Caseyville, and Cairo. These installations placed training troops nearer to the anticipated theater of conflict, but they also cast a long shadow over potential secessionist activities in the state's southern tier. One area farmer opined, "Them brass missionaries has converted a heap of folks that was on the anxious seat." Men volunteered to serve for a number of reasons. Some evoked the spirit of the American Revolution when discussing their choice to enlist. One soldier wrote, "Freedom is just as dear to us now as it was to our forefathers in revolutionary times." Another soldier decided, "If our country and our nationality is to perish, better that we should all perish, and not survive to it a laughing stock for all posterity, to be pointed at as the unsuccessful trial of republicanism." Others feared that the South's secession was somehow related to their shrinking sense of individual autonomy. One man informed his wife that if the Confederates triumphed, she and their children would become perfect slaves, and that all their property would be seized to pay the war debt. While most Union soldiers were by no means abolitionists, few harbored any great love for the peculiar institution. Slaveholders and their representatives in Congress had long manipulated the federal government to protect their interests, and often appeared as pompous grandees, singularly out of place in a democratic political order. One dismissed Southern leaders as an aristocratic set of slave drivers and outlaws. This sectional identity drew in part upon a shared Christian faith, a belief in a free man's right to the fruits of his labor, and republican institutions. But Civil War soldiers fought for local communities, as well as their section and nation. Thus, the men of Illinois joined locally recruited military units, many of which sported nicknames like the Rock River Rifles and the Lead Mine Regiment. Soldiers also enlisted and fought on behalf of their families. One informed his father that he had volunteered to save the Union your ancestors and mine helped to make. The metaphor of family informed military units and the entire idea of union as well. Officers believed that they acted like fathers to their men. One's fellow soldiers became like brothers. President Lincoln won the nickname Father Abraham, the patriarch of a nation. Occasionally, the Civil War crossed and strained family ties. One Illinois soldier described an Arkansan who had left his family behind to fight for the Union as formerly a Southerner. When the unit's marches took the man near his old home, he saw his brother standing on the porch of his homestead and cursed him as a damned purty secesh. He refused to enter the home and invited his comrades to go in and take whatever they wanted, for he said that he knew they were Rebs, for they were his parents. Most communities saw their troops off to fight with a ritual flag presentation. In this ceremony, leading citizens and company commanders provided speeches at a large picnic or banquet. Local women provided a hand-sewn flag to the soldiers, who vowed to defend it as a vestige of all that they were fighting for. For many, the flag represented the women and families they protected by their participation in the war. The young United States had developed into two very different regional economies, tied together by a shared history and common political ideals. Yet Americans' legacy and ideals remained ambiguous, seeming to support both rebellion and union. Thus, soldiers and partisans on both sides struggled both to define their own cause and demonize their opponent, so recently a fellow American. Most soldiers convinced themselves that their enemy had somehow become un-American, and indeed inhuman. Since their earliest encounters with Indian tribes, white Americans had perceived their rivals for dominance on the continent as savages, somehow undeserving of the rights they so cherished themselves. In June of 1861, Union soldiers spread a story reporting that the women of Richmond wore jewelry made of the bones of Union soldiers. Others reported home that the cruelty of the rebels to our wounded has no parallel in history. Confederates, for their part, often characterized their opponents in blue in grim terms as well. One termed Union troops as a ruthless horde of marauders professing to be Christian. A rebel officer surveying the field at Chancellorsville reveled in the glorious heaps of Yankee dead. Despite these parallel, if rival, mythologies, Union and Confederate troops occasionally fraternized with one another at the margins of military life. War-weary troops often slipped out of camp in the evening to share a cigarette or a drink with their opponents. Most times, soldiers agreed that if the settlement of this was left to the enlisted men of both sides, we would soon go home. Often, these soldiers found a common bond in their service and experiences. One reported that the Union soldiers wanted to thrash their Confederate counterparts in order to end the war and get home, but they do not seem to hate them in the least. Military service often encroached upon soldiers' sense of individual freedom and autonomy. Army discipline could seem capricious and random. Many compared their experience to slavery. One complained that he was tired of being bound up worse than a Negro. Many soldiers also complained about the indignities that characterized all military camps. On the march, soldiers were unable to launder their uniforms. Even in camp, men proved unable to escape the consequences of living so near comrades with divergent standards of personal hygiene. Military camps became hotbeds of disease. Hospitals were the worst offenders. One soldier reasoned, "I had rather risk a battle than the hospitals."